Hi, and welcome to this tutorial of DaVinci Resolve 15. As we get started, I just want to note this tutorial is geared towards getting beginners up and running with Resolve. It is not an advanced course. DaVinci Resolve is a very robust and deep piece of software, and being that this video is for beginners, we can't go into every tool and every aspect of the program. If you complete this course or are interested in more advanced training, I implore you to go to Blackmagic's website for Resolve, or there are a myriad of tutorials available online. Okay, this is something like what your window should look like once you've downloaded Resolve and launched it. I went ahead and already have one timeline in here, one project. Normally you would only see this Untitled Project. Now DaVinci Resolve is a really great piece of software. It's very powerful, great with color, and best of all, it's free. So we're going to go ahead and get started by clicking into Untitled Project. Okay, so this opens up and gives us a whole new blank project. And the first thing we need to do is get media into our project. So I'm actually on the wrong window here. I'm on Edit, and I'm going to come over to Media. This is actually bothering me. My little desktop bar keeps coming up and down, and to fix that I'm going to come up to Workspace and Full Screen, and this is going to lock the software into a full screen mode. If I ever want to get out of that, I can just come back up and click that again, and it'll take me out. Okay, so there's a few ways we can get media in here, but the way I want to show you is by going right here through the media window that Resolve gives you. So I'm going to come into Windows. I know where it is, and I'm going to come into Users, Myself, and I know it's on my desktop. And I went ahead and made this folder for this tutorial. And if I click on this, it's going to give me two clips here. One clip is inside another folder, so I'm just going to go ahead and drag those into my media pool. All right, and these are the two clips that I want to work with. You notice if I hover over, I get a preview of what that video is going to look like. I also have a preview window here where I can play and pause. And now that we've imported media into our project and our media pool, we still don't have a timeline. Okay, so to do that, I want to come over to my edit page, and you notice I still get to see my media here, but now we have a timeline. And if you're familiar with any other video editing software like Premiere or After Effects, even iMovie, you'll be familiar with this sort of layout of a media window and a timeline with a preview window. The layout is fairly customizable. I encourage you to come up to Workspace, and you can play with certain ways that the interface appears. Right now I have this set up for a double screen, but you can change all of that. Okay, so I'm gonna click and drag and highlight both of these, and I wanna come up, actually I'm gonna click out of that. I'm gonna come up to File and choose New Timeline. And so here we have a few options. We can name our timeline if we're gonna have multiple. I'm just gonna stay with timeline 1 for now. We get options for number of video tracks or audio tracks that the project will start off with. By default, it's gonna start off with 1, but if you want it to start off with 10 tracks, you're gonna be doing a heavy project, you can go ahead and enter that here. Right now, 1 is gonna be okay for me. And we also get an audio track type choice. So if I know that my audio is going to be stereo or mono or surround sound, I can go ahead and choose that here. I'm going to go ahead and stick with stereo. Okay, and then I'm just going to click Create. And you notice now in our media pool we have a timeline, and now this is actually editable. I'm actually going to use Control Z and step back, and you notice that here we have a timeline, but or a representation of one, but we can't click on it. So I'm going to come up and do that again, New Timeline, keep all that the same, and click Create. All right, so now we can go ahead and start clicking and dragging clips into our timeline, and those are going to appear as such. I'm going to do the same for this clip. Now the second clip has audio, and you notice down in my audio track, we get a green representation of that. Again, if you're familiar with any other video editing software, any other NLE, things like Premiere, After Effects, yeah, like I said, even iMovie, you're going to be familiar with a lot of the tools here, right? So we have the basic selection tool where we can select, click, and drag things around. We have a razor tool where we can cut clips up and cut audio up. Just going to Control Z, back out of those. And we have a few other options here for linking files and for snapping clips together. Here we have a zoom window, so I can zoom out of my project and see it in large scale, or I can zoom way in, per frame and make a really specific cut here. We have typical sort of transport controls, right? We have solo and mute for our audio tracks. We have this play and stop here, activated with our spacebar really easily. And so I actually don't think I want to, let's go ahead and take a look at some of these. Slow motion, stop motion, shot. And I want to take a look at this. So yeah, I actually do want to cut some of this second clip, but I actually want to wait. But I'm wanting to go ahead and show ways that you can cut. Like I said, you can come in with the razor tool right here and find a place where you would want to cut and click right there in your timeline. And if you want to really get in there, you can zoom in and make a few cuts and then come back to the selection tool and move those around wherever you might want. Or you can also just use your delete or backspace key to get rid of those clips. We can also, I'm going to zoom out again, come to the end of a clip, and we're given some brackets here where we can slide that clip in or out. And we can always slide that clip back out, which is what's nice about that. I'm going to Control Z, back out of a few of these things. Oh, no, went too far. Okay, so we went over the media window where we're going to import our media into the media pool. Then we came over to the edit window and created a timeline and added our clips to the timeline. And this is a pretty typical editing space. DaVinci separates each of its functions. It has a ton of functions, but they're separated into these, 6 categories: media, edit, fusion, color, Fairlight, and deliver. So media and edit we've covered. Fusion, DaVinci has added support for integrating. Fusion is, DaVinci has added support for integrating computer graphics or special effects, 3D motion graphics in with film, similar to things like After Effects. Something to note here, DaVinci works on a node-based editor, which we will talk about when we get to color. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time to get into the Fusion page of DaVinci Resolve, but if you're interested in compositing computer graphics and live action, you should definitely look into that. Okay, so here is the color page. DaVinci has a super powerful set of color options, and it's really what the program is best at, in my opinion. So real quickly, we can come over and we have a few options here. This first camera option, we have camera raw options, and all of this is locked as long as I'm using my project settings here, decode using. But if you switch over to clip, That's going to allow me to access all of my camera raw settings. So this is helpful for a few reasons. The first reason we can see our color space here, which we'll get back to in a second. But we have a few other reasons. We have shadows, exposure, highlights, saturation options here before we even start touching the color wheels. So this gets a little deeper into the sort of file, if you will, at a slightly more base level if you want to sort of pre-apply some settings before we get to the color wheels. Next is this color chart. So using a color checker, which we actually have in one of our clips, we can correct to color, and we're going to talk about that here in just a second. Next, we have these color wheels, and we have three sort of representations of those, but we have lift, gamma, gain, and offset. So lift is going to be our shadows. So if I drag this little slider right here to the left, it's going to bring the shadows or the darkest part of the image down. We're going to get less shadow detail, and those are going to become darker. I'm just going to use this little rewind arrow to reset. If I drag this to the right, our shadows or darkest parts are going to get even brighter. So they definitely don't need to be brighter there, so I'm going to reset that as well. Gamma is going to be our midtones. So these are really the middle points of the image are going to come up or down. Also, if I slide this bar to the left or to the right, reset there. Gain is going to be our highlights. So if I slide that to the right, our brightest parts or highlights are going to get brighter. And if I slide that to the left, they're going to get darker. And offset is going to be sort of a general overall extra option here. And we'll touch on that in a minute as well. We have an RGB mixer. We have another representation of our color input here. And we have motion effects, another thing we don't have time for today, but is very interesting. Over here, we have a few options from curves to an eyedropper and vignette windows, motion blur and keying, green screen, blue screen work, and some extra 3D options if you have those. Okay, so if we want to get started on color, I'm going to step back here and use this set of arrows to make this smaller so I can access these other clips. And it's really handy if I need to make it bigger, I can just hit those again and come back in and out of that. Okay, so we're going to click on this clip. And you notice this is some footage I took while I was in Nevada a couple years ago. So if you notice in this clip, I'm using what's called a color checker. And DaVinci supports a few color checkers. So XWrite and DSC Labs, also Data Color, has sort of grids for all of these different color correction tools. So we are using here the XWrite Color Checker Classic. And so I want to apply, the way it works is we're going to match these colors here to these colors. And this film was shot in log off of actually a Blackmagic camera. So it comes off very flat looking, right? So in both scenes, we see this very flat appearance in the film, and that gives us greater dynamic range, but also we have to do some work to get our footage back to a more normal looking area. So I'm going to come back to this clip and come back to wherever I'm holding this color checker still. So it seems to be still right there. Okay. So there's a few things. Well, first of all, we need to go up and instead of this eyedropper I'm seeing here, I want to go to this color chart. And this is going to give us the grid here, and these squares are going to correspond with these squares and those squares, right? So brown will be this top left, white the bottom left, black the bottom right, and this sort of teal, green, blue thing, the top right. The thing is, it's pretty small, so I can use my middle mouse button or scroll wheel to zoom in. And then I'm just going to actually click on, I actually played it by accident. I'm going to click on the middle mouse button to scroll around my image. I actually need to zoom out and make this a lot smaller. So by grabbing, it has all of these control points here. So by grabbing different ones, we can start to, it's going to look really weird at first, but we can start to shrink this down and get this over here. I'm going to zoom in again, just scrolling on my middle mouse, and click a few more of these control points. And again, the goal is to get these squares to line up with both the color squares, so we can have a reference here. Okay, so we're getting there. That guy, we got black in the bottom right, got white in the bottom left. Okay, so that looks pretty well lined up. But before we go ahead and click match, we need to know a few things. So it's asking us our source gamma and our target gamma. Well, we want to go into Rec 709. That's a fairly normal video space, color space. But we know our source gamma wasn't Rec 709. It was shot in RAW, it was shot in log. So what is that? You might know if you are a detailed or conscious camera person, but you might not know. And so going back to this camera raw option, instead of project again for decode, I'm going to use clip. And so here we see our color space. It's going to tell us it's not Rec 709, it's Blackmagic Design and Blackmagic Design Film for the gamma. Okay, so we can come back to the color checker window here, and our source gamma, we know now, scroll up, is this Blackmagic Design Film. And our target gamma is going to be this Rec 709, and as well as the color space. We can also set color temperature here. I'm gonna go ahead and click match. Now that all of our information is in and our grid is lined up, we've selected the right color checker here. So I'm gonna click, I'm going to zoom out first so we can see what it does. Okay, so I'm going to just click match. Okay, so that got us to a lot better of a starting point. I'm going to go ahead and right click in this window and split screen option right here. I'm going to say version and original so we can see those side by side. I want to get rid of this color checker here. It'll be there again if we want it to be in a while, but I'm going to turn that back to the qualifier and turn this back to split screen. And so here we can see the original, very flat, very desaturated, and after using the color checker, much more quote unquote normal looking footage that you might expect coming off of a Canon or something that already has a codec or a color profile applied. Okay, so I want to get off of split screen here and turn that off. I want to make this big again actually, and this is great that this got us to a better starting point here, but the image still looks a little off. So I'm going to come over to my color wheels. Thank you, color checker. And now we get to not only adjust the exposure of the image using these sliders we talked about, but also the color. So within the shadows, midtones, and highlights, we get to adjust the tone or color of those shadows, midtones, and highlights. So for example, our midtones personally look a little magenta. So here's magenta on our gamma, our midtones, and so I'm going to take those a little towards green and start that. Is starting to look a little bit better. So you see the skin tones are looking more normal, our colors are looking more normal, and we have a much more balanced image here. I do notice these rocks are a little bright. I might bring down my highlights just a touch. I'm actually going to leave them where they are. Okay, so I want to get out of this big view again, so I'm going to use these arrows here to shrink this back down and so I can see all my other clips. So I wanted to talk about DaVinci's nodes, right? So we have, you notice over to the right-hand window, we've got this space and we've got this depiction of our video with a line going in and coming out. So DaVinci uses what's called a node-based system or editor, whatever you might call it or refer to it. They're using nodes, and you might think of these as layers if you're familiar with Photoshop or Illustrator, something like that. These are just layers that you can filter or add on layers to your image of color correction. So generally you would do a color correction on your base layer and then all of your color grading on additional nodes. If you're also familiar with node editing from, say, 3D modeling like Maya or Cinema 4D, this is also a very similar idea of input and output. So we have here a beginning point, and we have an input channel here and an output channel. So we're really just telling things where they're going. So I can right click here if I wanted to make even more edits here. And I'm going to right click and say add node. And we get to pick what kind, and I'm going to say corrector. And so you notice it doesn't look like anything. It's totally blank and it's not attached to anything by nature. We have to go ahead and alter this course of events ourselves. So here, instead of going from the video to the final destination, we need to draw this to this output from the first node to the input of the second node. And then we need to draw the output of the second node to the final product. Right, and so now we see that the video goes through 2 layers before it reaches the final destination. So now while we're on this layer, you do need to be selected on the node that you want to be working on. You notice if we select back to this one, we get these same changes, and we don't want to do that. So we need to be selected on node 2. But we can now make edits on node 2, protecting what we already color corrected on node 1. So that could be, you know, come down here, down to the bottom, we have 2 pages, and we could start increasing contrast. We could start decreasing saturation, like a black and white feel. Come over and I'm actually going to take it away from black and white. Bring that back to 50. And we could really start, you know, really playing with it. So a few other things I want to go over. So yeah, we can start making, you know, all of these crazy edits here if we really want. But I want to use this second node to talk about another feature here in the middle. And so we have a curve. So if you're familiar with curves from Photoshop, it's very similar or exactly similar. So down at the bottom, you know, you have your lower values, and whether they are brighter or darker, and up at the top be your brighter values, and everywhere in between. And you can make multiple control points here and really play with your exposure that way. But I want to play with a few of these other options. So I can either use these dots here to go from option to option, or I can use this drop down menu to go from option to option. But using this qualifier, so if you don't see this qualifier, just go up here and make sure that you have qualifier selected and not one of these other tools. So using the qualifier, we can start to select a color. And so I can select, say, this blue in the sky right here. And it's going to give me a control point here in the middle with 2 anchor points of what it thinks that color is. And I can start grabbing that color now and really playing with what that is. So it identifies a hue and then changes that hue to another hue, hence the name hue versus hue, and we're going to go through the changes down here. So hue versus hue is going to pick a color and change that color based on this curve window, and so we can loosen up those controls if we want to pick a broader set of colors. So now you see that the grass and my jeans and things down here in the bottom are getting involved, that we broadened those colors. I'm actually gonna tighten them back in a little so we can stay with that sky. And I'm gonna Control Z actually out of all of that so we can go to the next option. So that's hue versus hue. Hue versus saturation is gonna pick a hue, and instead of changing the color, now our curves graph is versus saturation. So up is going to be whatever that color is will become similar colors, or that color exactly will become more saturated. And dragging that down is that color will become less saturated. So now if you look at the sky, we have almost no blue here in the sky, as opposed to a very saturated blue. I'm gonna Control Z out of those. And another example here for hue versus saturation, we can pick one of these greens here, and then start to say the trees, just the trees, are more saturated or not saturated, while we still leave other colors untouched. So that can be a pretty cool way to isolate colors and start editing them with hue versus hue and hue versus saturation. Next is hue versus luminance. So I'm going to pick again that same blue, and it's going to be versus luminance. So that whatever color I pick, higher, it's going to increase the luminance, or the sort of brightness, for lack of a better word, of that color, and down will do the opposite. It'll make it darker. Control Z out of those. And luminance versus saturation, you notice now we get a different window. Now instead of picking a color, we're picking a luminance. So whatever the luminance of what we pick is, so I'm going to go again with the sky for consistency. Our control point here will control how saturated things of that luminance are. So if I bring that down, you see here in the clouds, in a few other places, we start to get this real gray nothing. Or if I bring it up, it's a little too much there. I'm going to Control Z and pick a different color so we can see it a little better. I'm going to pick one of these greens here. And now everything with the luminance of that green I picked, again, I didn't pick green, I was picking more or less a brightness or luminance of a subject. Everything with the luminance of that tree or that color is going to come up or down. I just want to stress that it's not things of the same color here for luminance versus saturation. It would be things of the same luminance. And we have saturation versus saturation. So here I'm going to pick something very saturated, or whatever I pick, it's going to look at its saturation and then pick things of similar saturation. And we're going to be able to bring that then up or down. Bring these, Control Z out of those. Try and pick something else here. Shirt. Okay, so those are some pretty interesting tools, definitely, to start playing with clips. So we're gonna try and make a few sort of crazy edits here and turn, say, maybe the sky this pink color, and maybe we can turn some of these trees also like maybe a blue. And yeah, I want those to go more blue. I'm going to bring my midtones sort of blue here, but my shadows, I want to sort of stay there. Okay, so that's looking pretty funky already. So I'm going to go ahead and add a third node here. And again, I need to take my output here into this input and this output to the final product and sort of rearrange. Okay. And so now I can make a whole new set of edits here. So I'm going to sort of go for it even more. I'm going to start All right. Okay. So you can see here on the right-hand side that we have this base layer. So I can hover over and it's going to show me sort of what tools I used on each layer. And so this was where we just color corrected. Here was sort of a middle step of adding some weird colors. And here was this sort of full-fledged craziness that's happening, right? And so at any time we can get rid of either of these layers by clicking them and using the backspace or delete key, or we can just sort of take them out of the loop, right? So we can just bypass them. So this node 1 just needs its output directed at the final product. And now these are no longer actually connected. This line shouldn't be here. So we can see that we're back to just our color corrected footage right there. And if we wanted to bring back, say, node 3, but not node 2, we're still not, stuck to any of this. So I can just bring my output here to the input of node 2, or 3, I'm sorry, and node 3's output to the final destination. And now we have just node 1 and node 3 without node 2. Yeah, there we go. Get rid of that line that's confusing. Right, so we're really just input and output here, and I'm just going to do this one more time and connect all 3 of these. There we go, to that super weird final product. Or I'm just going to get rid of them one more time to try and illustrate. Now we're back to just our color corrected footage. And so this can be a really handy and great way to work. DaVinci just has these really deep, powerful color options here. Yeah. Okay, so we've color corrected this second clip here, but we still need to go back and do the first. And so the first thing I'm noticing is that, right, it is very flat, so we definitely need to build up the contrast, but instead of just coming down to the bottom and trying to boost up contrast that way, we're just going to try and visually take a look at this image. I have no color checker here. We just need to go off of what we see. So first of all, I have basically no blacks or shadows in this photo or video at all. So we need to bring these shadows down. Also, if you're someone that works with scopes, we have scopes available here through Workspace and video scopes, and you can choose different scopes to come in and out or on and off. And so this can also be a way to visualize what you're doing if you want to that way. We're going to bring this down to the bottom or actually get rid of that for now. Okay, so I'm going to bring our shadows down a little bit. And we're going to bring our highlights up just a touch and our midtones down. I'm actually going to bring those scopes back up. So what we're looking at here is like a total black or darkness, and here's a pure white. And so we want these to almost touch these ends, but to never quite shove off into them. So if I brought that way up, you can see that we're losing a ton. A ton goes above that ceiling right there, or roof. And so we're losing a ton of information here where it's blowing out white. So we want to keep that below there. So we just want that to sort of barely tickle or touch that line. Bring it up just a little more. And same here for the bottom. We just want this bottom to just barely scrape or avoid this this floor. Okay. So it's pretty hot. It's contrasty here still. So I'm going to reset my midtones and try and bring up those midtones. to a better level where we can get that not so hot. Okay, so we have a better exposure here. We can go to our split screen version in original. So it's certainly a better exposure. We can at least see what's happening here now. But the color is still a little off, so we're gonna turn that split screen off and make that larger. Get rid of these scopes for now. And so this, I'm gonna come in and start trying to build up some of this color. So I'm gonna come here to hue versus saturation and try and pick some of this blue and increase some of what we're seeing out of Okay, so I'm gonna try and use this hue versus saturation to try and build up some of what is here in this sky. So I've done that there. And I'm gonna come back into my midtones and try and, actually I'm gonna come back down into my saturation here, and I can either click and type in a number like 100, or I can click and drag with my mouse and sort of slide that up or down. So 100 is obviously too much. I'm gonna bring this down to 75. And just, actually I'm gonna slide this around and see, I think somewhere around 60, 65 looks good. And we can actually tone down sky just a touch. And I also want to do some of the same for some of the sand. And then, that's a good lesson. Never edit while your subject is in total shadow, or, you should. But here now we have, perhaps a 2-bar. I want to pull those scopes back up from here in Workspace to scopes. Turn on. And now you see it's very compressed here in the middle, right? As opposed to what we were working with. So we should actually take this into account and try and counterbalance for if this is going to be coming in and out of highlight and shadow. Overall, it doesn't look bad, but I'd rather have the dark parts be a little too dark than the bright parts to be overexposed. I'm gonna come in just here and try and bring down a few of these, actually bring up a few of these highlights and perhaps bring down some of those shadows. All right, so now we have a much better, much more natural looking product. Let's take a look at this again. Now it is a little dark here, but you remember we're going to come into a much brighter scene. So we sort of try to meet the two in the middle where it's going to look normal both ways. Yeah, and I think this works really well. I think the shadows playing off of the mountains really come out with the contrast, and now we've color balanced. Now we've gone over to the other clip. So I'm going to come out of this again and come back here. I'm going to turn split screen back on and look at the original and color corrected. So especially here is a nice example where we can see very washed out. You might think you lost a scene if you didn't know what you were working with, but you can really pull all of that information back out, whether that's overblown highlights or underexposed shadows. And this was, again, node 1 here, so we can, again, add a node and direct that to the appropriate places. And now here on node 2, start coming in and making, more edits. Okay. All right, great. So we're gonna get rid of this one as well, again, by taking those over. And we're going to turn split screen back off. I want to take another look on zoom out here. I'll go ahead and take another look at this clip. It's a little too saturated, but like I said, the color checker got us to a much better place, much more natural looking place here. Okay, so that is a brief introduction to the color page. There are a ton more options and techniques to ways you can go about color correcting and color grading your footage and building those color profiles and working with LUTs or log footage or maybe compressed footage and really layering those sorts of effects there. Okay, so we're going to move on to Resolve's Fairlight page. This is their audio editing page. And so we have 39 audio meters up top, and if we get rid of this little window, we actually go up to 51 here, but I'm going to put that back and leave it at 39 because I am nowhere close to that. We only have one track in this project. So this window is dedicated only to audio. The only video we see is up top right. We get a representation or a link to at least what we're looking at while we're editing, but we really only see the audio here, and we get these audio meters and sliders with our master fader and an ability to throw effects on buses or tracks and come through and use noise reduction or reverb, a ton of things here to work with your audio in-house, or if you want to, export it out and bring it back in to another program. So in the, if we come up to the upper left, we have this effects library where we can go through and also choose effects to throw on different clips. We also have a sound library if one is connected, one is not right now. We also have this ADR option here. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that there. And so this audio page is fairly powerful. I don't feel the need to go through it here. If you're familiar with other audio editing like Audition or Audacity, Pro Tools, or any of this stuff, or even working with your audio within, say, Premiere, iMovie, or anything, it's going to be very similar. It's going to have a lot more options and audio files, of which I am not, can have a fun time playing with audio in here, or, again, you can round trip it to another piece of software like Pro Tools or Logic or Audition, whatever you're using. Okay, so our final page here is going to be Deliver, and this is going to be our export page, for lack of a better term. We're not going to come up to File, Export. Right here we have Export Project. We also have Save Project As. Both times, you see people thinking that this is going to export their final video, and this is really just related to your project and where your project is saved and how you're storing that stuff. To export, we do have to deal with this Deliver page here. Like I said, there's almost 6 pieces of software here within one on each of these pages, and they're all built for one thing only. So we're gonna let's see. Okay, so we've color corrected. We actually didn't cut much, but this being this sample project, we showed how to cut, right? So we have this color graded, or at least color corrected footage here that we need to export out as a final product. So here, just when I switched from Fairlight to Deliver, we're confronted with this. We have a timeline here. We have our clips that are here in the middle here. We do have a preview window where we get, not all of the same options, but we can look at scopes if we want. I'm going to zoom to fit there. And here to the left and the upper left is sort of where all the business is happening, right? We can name our file. So here I'm going to use a naming convention. My name, Baker Jonathan. So I use last name, first name, what it is, and when it is personally. So it's going to be a Resolve tutorial example. And this is the fall of 2018. And then location, we can click browse, and I'm just going to throw it on my desktop right now. We can choose to render a single clip or individual clips. Basically, if you want your timeline to come out as one long movie, which usually you do, you would stay with this single clip. If you wanted your timeline to come out as a bunch of individual clips, you would choose this. Sometimes that can be advantageous, but be careful that you're not going to export, 100 clips to your desktop and then you don't know what's going on. I'm going to stay with single clip right here. Okay, so we're going to stay here with video, and we have this checkbox for export video, and I want to leave that checked on, obviously. Under format and codec, we get a lot of options. QuickTime is going to be fine here. I can also choose MP4 for a common export. You know what? Actually, this is a great time to talk about all of these presets that DaVinci uses up top. So they have a bunch of presets for sending your project to different places. So if you're, say round tripping to Pro Tools or Avid, Premiere, or if you want to export, render out for YouTube or Vimeo in a specific resolution or H.264 master, you can go ahead and pick one of these, and it's going to auto apply all of these options here for you. So in this case, the most common, we're going to stick with YouTube or Vimeo. I'm going to stick with YouTube. And this footage is 1080p, so 1920 by 1080 pixels. So I'm going to stick with that. And if I scroll down, you see it's sticking with our format of QuickTime. Our codec is H.264, so very common codec. We won't have an issue there. Resolution is going to stay at 1080, and our frame rate was shot at 24, so it's going to stay at 24. Quality, we're going to leave that how it is. And yeah, okay, great. So really, if you're not sort of exporting a master file or an archival file, if you're wanting to just get a workable movie out of the software, you're gonna just want to choose one of these YouTube or Vimeo presets, and that is gonna kick out a very workable file that's gonna work on anything, your phone, your email, your Facebook, YouTube. If you're trying to put out an archival thing or something like that, you probably want to do some research. You come here to custom, and you probably want to do some research on what containers and codecs are going to be best for what you're working with, whether it's high res or you don't want to lose any data, or you're making this archival copy. Certainly research different codecs and different ways of working that way. Okay, so then what's left to do, I've named it and told it where to save. I've given it this YouTube 1080 preset, and I'm just gonna play through a little one last time and look at what we have here. Make sure we're happy with this. Yeah, that looks good. This is more of an example, but yeah. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and add to render queue. So that actually didn't start the render in process, right? It added it to our queue. So most programs, whenever you press, export or render, do it now. It's going to do it right now. But DaVinci, we have an extra step here. It's going to add it to our queue. And this is handy because say I did want to make a YouTube export, and then I want to make, say, a 720 export for like phones. And I want like a 4K thing for my home theater. And then I want to come and, do a custom, whatever super high res, uncompressed, thing, and export it that way. And we're going to add that to the queue. And then we can just say start render, or render queue. And then we can just come over here and say start render, and it's gonna just start rendering through all of these one at a time. And it's really handy because then you'll have, all of your just sort of different outputs all in one, and you don't have to keep coming back and doing it and waiting on it and doing it and waiting on it. You can set up all your renders and then, go eat a sandwich, come back, and they're gonna be done, or at least, on their way. A couple things we didn't talk about. I'm going to come back into some of these other pages. Down here in this lower right-hand corner, we have this cog wheel, and this is going to be all of our project settings. So fairly important for sort of like the beginning of your project at times. Generally, when you import footage in, it's going to sort of auto-assume whatever metadata is in that file is sort of the settings you want to use for the project that you're working on. But sometimes they're not, or sometimes you want to change them. So we can come and change, the resolution of our timeline and our frame rate, all of this stuff. We also have a bunch of options here. Another thing I want to talk about here on the edit page is unlinking media. So you notice that we can click and drag, and usually the audio for a clip will stay with that clip, and usually that's a good thing, but sometimes you want to delete audio or replace it or move it around. So if I just right click and come down here to link clips and turn that off, now we have independent audio and video channels or tracks moving around. So we can select all that and delete it and replace it with new audio, or we can bring that back and move it around, have it hanging off in a few places. We can also start layering video on top of each other. So I can drag this up and just onto another track here and start, playing with ways of opacity. And so we can bring these end clips here, and this is gonna like auto fade in and out if we want. All right, Thank you for joining me for this tutorial of DaVinci Resolve 15.